but there are a couple of key differences between the product that are important that you take the time for, right? So the very first thing I always like to emphasize between it is that the CME's product is 5 Bitcoins versus the CBOE's, which is 1 Bitcoin. So that's a big difference when you think about it. So when you look at that 5 Bitcoin to 1 is the first thing to think about. The second thing I would say to look at is how does the tick size work? With the CME product, it's a $5 per coin. So think about that, that's 5 then per coin times 5, or $25, versus the CBOE product, which is $10. And then finally, the last thing is there is a little bit of difference between the actual trading hours, not a ton, but a little bit, so you need to keep track of that as well. And then finally, the last two things to highlight is, one, there are differences in exchange fees. The CME's product is $5 versus 50 cents for the CBOE. And then the last one, of course, is the margin requirement. But the big thing about the margin requirement to emphasize here is, while CME is 47% and the CBOE's is 44%, think about it, you have to do that from a notional value standpoint. So you take where the price is, let's say roughly at 20,000, multiply that by 5, that's how you get the CME product times that 47%. So you're talking about a very large number to place a single trade versus on the CBOE, using the same number, using that 20,000, multiply that by 44%. But in both cases, and especially the CBOE, we do have increased margins that we are using right now because of the fact that the product is new and it's got some volatility.
All right, so increased margins, JB, a little bit of information there in terms of the difference between the two products as far as some of the specs goes. I'm curious as far as the difference in the two products as far as the launch last week at the CBOE versus the launch last night at the CME. What stood out to you?
What was really interesting about this was the fact that the CBOE product had a much bigger response. And I think there's a real reason to highlight the why of this is because this is a retail-focused product. It's a single coin. It's not that expensive. So in the first 2 hours of the CBOE's launch, over 2,000 contracts traded. When you compare that versus the CME, they had less than 300 trade. So what you saw here was sort of a very tepid response where that CME product has more of that institutional feel to it versus the CBOEs, which has more of that retail product. And you kind of can watch that go for the rest of the day. Overnight, right now, a little under 2,500 contracts have traded for the CBOE, around 700 for the CME. So you see a little bit more of a tempered or tepid response to the CME product. I think that's just because of the fact it's just not that much of a retail-focused product today.
JB, I think there is a clear, from my naked eye, I think there's a clear difference between the two products. And what you're saying is significant. Well, I look at the one versus the 5. I look at the exchange fees. I think you're right. I think the CBOE is more geared towards the retail investor, right? So which one is going to win out over time, though, is the real question, right? Well, where is the big volume coming from?
No, I think that's exactly the big question that's out there. I think what you've seen is that the CBOE went after a specific subset of customers, and that subset of customers were retail-based customers. And they reached out to them and they said, hey, look, this is a product I know you want to trade. Look, you don't want to necessarily have to use as much money as it costs to buy a single Bitcoin if you really wanted that cash market. So CBOE has been able to leverage and grab that piece and grab that customer base, and that's where they're attracting. You're starting to see that again happen this week. Again, very good flows to start off this week. You want to see that continue. Strong flows overnight, and that's the other thing to remember. These are 24-hour products, right? So watching them and making sure that there's liquidity in the Asian hours, in the European hours, and then the US hours is really important to see the success of the products.